So this is the second workflow that we're going to be looking at. In this workflow, what's going to happen is that we're going to take a video as an input. We're going to point it in the direction of something that we want to remove from the video, and we're going to get a clean version of the video by the end. Keep in mind that this is not a silver bullet. You are going to be needing to play around with seeds, because you might need to do 10, 15 versions until you get one that you like. I think at this stage, I've done it so much that I know more or less what to throw at the prompt. I know more or less what to do matting, and I'm going to be guiding you through some of those things. And there's a few tricks just to get quicker generations at the beginning so that you can assess whether that seed is a good one or that prompt is a good one. In no time, you're going to be generating, let's say, 5 to 7 versions, and you're going to be getting at least 1 or 2 that are useful. What I like to do is I like to queue many, sometimes 20, so that I have options. And if a good option isn't within those 20, I just cook some more. That's the nice thing about this. You can just, go grab yourself a cup of tea, come back, and then you'll have some more. But it's pretty great because they all vary in ways that sometimes you might not expect. Sometimes they can surprise you. Sometimes they can frustrate you. You can save a lot of time doing it with this approach. So this is the main workflow. And what this workflow does is you're going to be inputting image sequence or video in. You're going to guide it with a mat in order to tell it where the area is that you want to do a change in. You're going to prompt it for the change. You're going to give it a reference image if that's something that you want to do, because that's optional. And then you're going to let it run. And then hopefully by the end, you're going to be producing something that removes the subject or is going to achieve the cleanup that you're after. This is not a workflow that you're going to be finding on the browser here inside of ComfyUI. This is something completely custom that I've built. It's something that I've been using and evolving over the past few months. And at this point, I almost call it complete, unless something else comes out that could improve what I'm doing here, or unless I get new knowledge of something that at the moment I don't know. Hopefully it's something that you're going to find useful. So let me walk you through how this workflow is built and how you should be following the flow of it all the way up to your output. You want to start here on the left in the models backdrop. And as the name says, in this backdrop, you're going to be finding all the models that you're going to be needing for this workflow. And just like in Nuke, if you've used stamps, you're going to be very comfortable using the set and get nodes. However, the way the workflow is built, you shouldn't be needing to pipe anything. Everything is very modular. It has switches all over the place if you want to switch to one thing or another. But just know that what these endings are doing is essentially behaving like stamps in Nuke. So I'm going to be putting here the one model, and then that's going to populate throughout my workflow. So again, in the models backdrop, you're going to find all the models, a few options here and there. For the model itself, there are 2 flavors. I'm going to be using the 2.1 vase, as you can see here. And we have the 14B version, and we also have the 1.3B. So that stands for the amount of parameters that this was trained on, 14 billion and 1.3 billion respectively. One is, of course, much smaller than the other. So the 14B is always going to produce nicer, crisper results at the price of VRAM and time. So something for you to keep in mind. Whereas the 1.3B is very speedy and very efficient and fits in most GPUs. Funny enough, I use the 1.3B almost more than 50% of the time. Especially if I'm prototyping something, I'm not going to be waiting around for the 14 billion model. I just go with the much lighter one. And yeah, I'm going to say 50%, but maybe 60% of the time I end up using the 1.3 billion model. Important to note that the cleanups that I'm going to be showing are pretty aggressive and not something that I would necessarily use in production in that sense. I just wanted to take it to the limit so that you can more or less see where the limit is, at least with my hardware. But when I actually use it for work, I try to make it so that it's not something as hero as the things that I'm going to be removing in the examples here. Okay, we've talked about the models. I guess the one thing you need to know about these two is, or specifically the 14 billion model parameter here, is that I enabled something that's called block swapping. And that's so that If it doesn't fit in your VRAM, which again, I have 32 gigs of VRAM, you can just set this to 0, or you can just disconnect this if you have more VRAM, and great. I just find that for me, 20 is the sweet spot, so I keep it at 20. If I didn't have this, I wouldn't be able to run the 14 billion model. So I do keep that on. The next thing you need to know is that I have Sage Attention installed. What Sage Attention does is it's going to help you speed up your generations. If you don't have it installed, or you get an error when you're running it that's related to Sage Attention, all you need to do is come here and switch this to SDPA as it shows here. And that's about it. I added a note just in case you can follow the notes. I've added quite a few around the workflow, but because I have Sage Attention installed and because I know it's going to make my generations faster, I'm just going to enable it. Same goes for the 1.3 billion parameter model. And then because I have 2 versions of the model, I added a switch. So if I'm using the 1.3 billion models, I can just set this to false as I have it now. If I'm going to be using the bigger model, I can just set this to true, and that's essentially just switching the output over here. That's the only thing that this thing here is doing. So moving on here at the bottom, we're going to be needing the 1.2.1 VAE as well as the text encoder. And again, all of the models I've added links to, so you can go ahead and just follow the link, download the models, and it's actually going to tell you also where to put those models in the directories within Comfy, so that the workflow can find them once you copy that over. And then as an added extra, very much optional, I also added an upscale model. I don't use it all the time, but this is so quick to run that I most times just leave it on, because why not have a crisper version? So I have the vanilla output, and then I have an upscaled version that we'll get to at the very end. Next up, we're gonna go into the plate backdrop. And in the plate backdrop, as the name implies, we are just going to be adding the plate that we want work done in. So because we're going to be doing the soccer example, I'm going to Alt tab here onto my my Windows Explorer. I'm going to find my football plate. I have here my PNG sequence. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the directory, not the files themselves. You want to copy the directory. And then in this node, you're going to click here inside directory, and then you're going to aim it at that directory where we rendered our PNG sequence, and you can see we have the option to use the PNG sequence. This is where you could add an EXR reader if you wanted to install that, but for this example, I'm just going to keep it within PNG and MP4. And then again, just because I find when I'm prototyping, MP4s tend to be slightly faster to process, I am going to go back here into my Windows Explorer. And now I'm going to go into driving videos, and I'm going to drag in my soccer example. Because I have the 2 options, whether reading the PNGs or the MP4s, I added another switch here. If set to false, we're going to be looking at the MP4s, which is what I want. Once you have all of that in there, you can come here over in the settings. So you want to select how many frames you want to be generating. Like I said, in this example, I'm going to be doing 81. But feel free to go into the hundreds. I've done 300-400 frames, no problem, especially with the 1.3 billion parameter model. But just so that we keep examples within a timely fashion, I'm keeping it at 81. And then width and height, same deal, keeping it low. But what I would usually do is I do for the width something like 1280 by 720. And I added a bit of a cheat sheet here so that if you're using the 1.3 billion model parameter, these are the resolutions that it likes. It doesn't mean that you have to stick to them. It's just where the results will make the most sense, because that's where the training data that it was done on that resolution. And then for the 14 billion model parameter, you can go a bit higher, but you can also keep it a bit lower. So in this example, I am setting it to just their default 832 by 480. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you're thinking about these cleanups, if we go back to Nuke here for a second, you don't necessarily need to render out the whole plate, right? You have to be smart with the resolution, because as you can see, the resolution is really the constraint of these models, even at 720p. So let's say, for example, that this is our example here, but you only wanted to remove something that really doesn't occupy the majority of the plate, like this example is. You can just crop the area. So let's say we wanted to get rid of this guy over here. What you do is that you'd crop an area that is 832 by 480, where it just focuses on the subject you want to remove. And then you just reformat that. Let's say that was the correct resolution. And then you could just render that out. And that way you don't have to really process the whole thing, because it's not efficient and it's not going to give you the best result. You want to play with as many pixels as possible, and limiting it actually helps the model quite a bit. Now that we've set our resolution, our frame count, brought in our plates, and selected whether we're using image sequence or MP4s, we're kind of ready. Everything else is self-populating in the workflow. So the next step would be looking into matting. So same deal goes here. If we had an image sequence for the mat, you can just paste it there and you're up and running. And for this example, I am actually going to look for my mat here of the soccer. So remember, we have the fence mat MP4. I'll drop that in there, and that's our mat that we generated before. Again, switch, I'm going to keep to false because I'm going to be using the MP4. Everything else happens automatically. This is an optional thing that I use sometimes, and this is like a grow mask with blur. You can just disable this node by selecting it and hitting Control B. What this does is, imagine just erode and blur. So you can either grow or shrink the mask. In this case, I'm happy with my mask as I have it. Even with the harsh edges, it seems to play well. In general, I always have pretty hard edged mats, and they do a pretty good job. So I add that as an optional because it does come up sometimes, so I don't have to go back into Nuke, re-render a mat. I can just deal with it here internally in ComfyUI. And then at the bottom of the matting backdrop here, what we have is a matte preview. If I just select this node again and hit the green play button, what's going to happen is it's going to process anything related to this output. So you can see it's looking at our mat, it's processing it, it's resizing it, and then it's going to give us a result here. And this is just for me to sanity check that my mats are correct before I even hit run for the whole workflow. And the reason for doing that is because depending on what you're doing, depending on what model you're doing, what resolution you're doing, you could be waiting a while. I usually try to do it so that if I'm using a workflow like this, I don't like my generations to go over 5 to 15 minutes. So you don't want to be losing 5 to 15 minutes because your mat wasn't in the right place. So this is just a sanity check that everything is correct, the resolution changes are playing well, and if you're happy with that, you can just move on to the next area. Next up is the prompt. Pretty straightforward. What the prompt does is it gives the model instructions on what you want to see. In this case, I've added something that says clear view at an out of focus group of people playing soccer. I find clear view at being a pretty successful prompt when I'm trying to remove something. I don't know, it might just be that I've used it so much that at this point it's muscle memory, but I've had good success with it. So I do add it more often than not, depending of course on what you're trying to achieve. So once you have that, you can add also negative prompts. In this case, negative, I don't want to see a black fence or a foreground fence. And I sometimes helps. I feel like sometimes it ignores the negative prompt, but in the case it can help us, I'm always going to add it. So that's kind of it for the prompt. You just want to tell it what you want to see, what you don't want to see, and hopefully that'll help you down the line. Next up is the reference image here on the left. And again, it says optional. You don't really need to have a reference image. If you want to run it without, and honestly, I'm going to say 80% of the time I run it without a reference image and I get pretty good results. But again, I've been using this for a few months, so I know where to tweak things. What you can do if you don't want to use a reference image is you can either just select the node and hit Control B to disable it, or you can just go ahead and completely disconnect it here from the one video and code. In this case, we are going to be using the reference image, and the reason for that, which is actually important for you to know and understand, is that the model, when you give it a mat, has to try to imagine something in that shape to put into your video, right? So this is a very extreme case where 9 times out of 10, you look at the shape and you're gonna think, yes, that's a fence. So I tried many times to do this without a reference image, and after changing the prompt, changing different things here and there, I could not get a clean version of this. And that's where I said, okay, perfect. This is like a great example of where a mat is so clearly an object that the model recognizes that it's always going to throw a fence in there. Sometimes it was red, sometimes it was green, sometimes it was thin, sometimes it was thick, but it just thought, yeah, this guy wants a fence. It doesn't say anything about the fence, me wanting a fence in the prompt, but like I said, it just wouldn't do it. So in this case, we do want to use a reference image. So I'm just gonna go back into my Windows Explorer here, and I have here the image that we generated a little while ago, and I'm just going to drag that into my load image node, and now we have that image for the model to look at. So now it's going to be looking at that reference image. One thing for you to keep in mind, and now that we move on to the main backdrop here, where the brains do all the thing, the brains of the model, is if you're adding a reference image like we are here, I find most success bumping up the strength to 1.5, whereas if I did not have an image connected, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to set the strength to 1, maybe 1.1. But when I plug in an image, I feel that even at 1.3, 1.4, it doesn't really do the best job. So feel free to start at 1.5 when you have a reference image. And I don't think I've ever bumped it past a strength of 2. So I put that here on the note here on the side so that you know if you don't have an image, keep it at 1, 1.1, somewhere around there. And if you're using an image, keep it somewhere between 1.5 and 2. So now that we have that in place, this is basically the main node doing all of the heavy lifting. And that's why the models, the text embeds, everything else comes in here. And a few things that are connected here on the side that you should know about is the base encode, which we just discussed. You don't really need to change anything other than the strength and deciding whether you want to connect the reference image or not. And then there is Tcache. The way Tcache works is pretty interesting. So all of these generations are based off of steps, right? So let's say 15 steps. What those steps are doing is they are denoising an image over those 15 steps. It's like progressively removing noise until it gives you hopefully a crisp image. What Tcache does is within a threshold, which is this first setting here, it's going to check whether the next denoise step is close enough that it can just skip it all together and then saving you that generation time. So let's say you have 15 steps. If the denoise steps for those 15 steps, let's say 3 of them were skipped because it finds that they're too close to each other in terms of how they look, they skip it all together. Well, now you're only waiting for 12 steps instead of 15. You can play around with this in terms of how aggressive you want to be with this. If you want the best generation possible, just disconnect it and ignore Tcache altogether. And that's always going to force the model to go through all the steps. If you're smart about it and you keep it low enough, you're going to be saving a lot of time and not losing a lot of quality. So I always keep it at 0.1 when I'm doing it at the resolution we're working at. If I go with a bit higher, I usually bump it up somewhere like 0.15 or 0.2. And I added a bit of a cheat sheet here on the side so you get an idea of what values to play around with. But the more you do these things, you'll get a feel for it. You just don't want to bump it up so much that you're skipping so many steps that you're getting an image that doesn't look as good as it could. The one video sampler is the one that's going to be doing the heavy lifting here and the one that's going to keep you waiting the most. And I've already explained a few of the connections that come in. You don't really need to worry about every single one. What do you need to know about this is you want to keep steps as high as possible without going crazy. And if you're just testing things, feel free to just drop it down something like 6. So that way it's going to run through very quickly because it's only going to denoise 6 steps rather than 15, 20, 30, whatever it is you're going to be doing denoising at final quality. But it'll give you an idea of whether the seed, your prompt, your reference image is doing the job you want it to do. Because once you find a seed, a combination of seed, reference image, and prompt that is giving you something that looks like it's going in the right direction, that's when you can just go back in here and pump it up and you'll be getting something that is of course cleaner, but you had a bit of a chance to sanity check it before you did the full commitment to a high step count. Something like 8 is a number that I like to start with so that I can have quick enough results for me to start taking a look at the possibilities of this being an option. And then what I do is I just leave my seed at whatever number, and then I switch this to increment. And then what I do is I come up here to the top right, and maybe I just set 10, a batch of 10. So then I hit run, and then I just wait for those 10 options to come through at low steps And then if I see one that I like, I just use that as the seed that I'm going to be sticking with. So let's see, out of those 10, let's say that 1006 is the one I liked. So I do that. And then I just bump up my samples to however much I want. I usually keep it somewhere around 30. There are edge cases where I felt the need to bump it up to 50 just to get a bit of a crisper image. But again, because I'm not always removing something that is superhero, and you honestly shouldn't because it's not meant for that, 30 is a good spot to land on. Even 25 does a pretty good job. So for now, I'm going to keep it at 20. And then once you're ready with that, honestly, that's kind of it for the workflow. Now it's all about generating options and looking at the results. The last couple of backdrops here are output and upscale. And the name pretty much tells you what they're going to be doing. You can just select all the nodes here in the upscale backdrop and hit Control B if it's something you want to enable. For now, I'm going to keep it off. What I do is I try to do a few generations until I find something that I like, and then I just run it through the upscaler. It doesn't always produce the results here after, but it's so quick to generate that it's always worth having. So at this stage, I'm just going to hit run, and we'll wait for a bit. The models are going to be loaded. It's going to be processing our plate, the mat, sort of everything that we've done here. Look at the reference image, and then it's going to start cooking our video, and hopefully we'll get a result that we like. All right, so here are the results, and just FYI, I ran initially at 15. I didn't realize I had it set to 15, and let me show you a few of the stats down here. When I ran it at 15 steps, which you can tell here, the T-cache that I was talking about before skipped two of those steps. So step 9 and step 14, essentially only processing 13 of those steps, and that's why T-cache is so nice at saving you time. That initial generation where all the models need to get loaded, which only happens the first time, the first generation is always going to be the slowest. That took 120 seconds to produce the 15-step version. And then the subsequent one, when I realized I had done it at 15 instead of 20, I upped it again to 20 steps. And you can see T-cache actually skipped a bunch of different steps. So 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So it skipped a total of 6 steps out of the 20. Essentially only processing 14. So again, if you can run T-cache, I would highly recommend it because it saves you a lot of time. And this generation with more steps only took 66 seconds because the models were already loaded into VRAM. So if we look at our result here, you can see it did exactly what we added. It removed the black vents. And if we look at the side by side here, you can see it's pretty successful. Important to note that there's always a bit of a color shift, so you can see the video on the right has a bit of maybe a bit more blue, a bit more saturation in general, and it has a bit of a twinkly feel. Like you can tell there's some things that are like not very stable. So we have two options here. We can increase the samples, right? So we can maybe bump it up to 30, 40 and see what that looks like. But you'd be surprised once we take this into Nuke and properly key mix it so that we only use the bits that we want. We're not going to be seeing any of that twinkling because we want to keep as much as the original plate as possible. So next up, we'll move on into Nuke and I'll show you how I put these two together. Now I'm back in Nuke and I want to show you a couple of things before I comp together the results. The first thing I want to touch on is the container. In this case, the default, as you saw on the workflow, is an MP4. But of course, you can change it to anything here on the list, ProRes being one of those. You should always try to save something that isn't MP4 because it'll just inherently be more compressed. I always like to save a ProRes version of my outputs. And again, that's just as simple as coming back here to the workflow. In the output backdrop, you come here into Format. Let me just zoom in so that you can read this. And then you would look for ProRes down here at the bottom. Once you do that, as long as the seed is the same, you can either create a copy of this combined node and just set one for MP4 and another for ProRes, or you can just skip the MP4 altogether. The nice thing about the MP4 is that it has the workflow embedded, so it's always nice to have copies of the workflow just in case you need to go back. Let me show you why this is important. If you look at the result I have here from my MP4, well, it looks, as we saw it on the preview inside of Comfy. If I A/B between those two, you can see the amount of compression that is introduced. So this is the ProRes version, and this is the MP4 version. And while you do have some control over the compression in ComfyUI, so if you come here and you have MP4 selected, this CRF value, that is what you can use to control the amount of compression. So if you go back to Nuke, you can clearly see how there's a lot of compression artifacts introduced in the MP4 version versus the ProRes. And while yes, I am punching in quite aggressively here, it's still pretty easily seen if I zoom out. I just know that this video is going to be compressed when I upload it, so I want to make sure that you can see it along with me. So if I just select these two, and let's say I just wipe here, you can see how much cleaner the ProRes version is compared to the MP4. So I did want to touch on that because the workflow is coming at a default of MP4, but you should always make it a habit of rendering out either a ProRes or EXRs. Even PNGs will give you a much cleaner result than just a straight up MP4s. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the steps. So as I said before, if we look at our result, even though I'm looking at my ProRes here, if I play this back, and I'm just gonna loop a little bit so that we can see the twinkling effect that we had spotted in Comfy. And like I said, we could always increase samples. So what I've gone ahead and done, just so that we can compare, is I rendered the original at 20 steps, which is what we're looking at now. And then I rendered the exact same thing at 50 steps. And not only that, I also disconnected Tcache. So if I come back here into the workflow, you'll see my Tcache is now completely disconnected. And that is so I can know that for sure, every single one of those steps was processed rather than skipping. So I wanted to get maximum quality, which is why I disconnected it. So if I look at this version of the 20 steps and now we look at the 50-step version, you see the difference is night and day. And because we're using the 1.3 billion parameter model for this, the time to generate this result was well worth the investment. So I believe it took somewhere along the lines of 3 minutes. So yeah, just under 3 minutes. So you can see here in the console, I completed the 50 steps, right? And they were completed basically 180 seconds, so just 3 minutes. So I'm gonna go back here into Nuke, and that shows you clearly the power behind steps. Like if you let it cook longer, the curve just gives you, diminishing returns after a certain amount. But when you're looking for that final image that you're going to be using, like I said in the workflow, and which I added in the notes, you should look at increasing it to something like 50, 60 is usually a safe bet, and that'll give you something that looks very, very stable like this. Okay, now that we have our result, what I'm going to do is, of course, I'm going to make sure that I use ProRes. I'm going to ensure that I use the most amount of steps for my result, and I'm going to go ahead and connect that one instead. The next thing I do here is, because I know there's always a bit of a color shift, which is a bit annoying, but it's not the end of the world considering the amount of let work that this takes care of. So all you need to do is grade your results slightly so that you match closer to the original footage. And then it's as simple as reusing the mat that we were using for our ComfyUI generation, and then making sure that you treat it a bit. So I'm going to look here at the alpha. So I'm expanding it a bit and I'm blurring it a bit just so that we can key mix the results. So I have my plate, and that's going to be key mixed by the mask that we prepared. And essentially that's going to give us a result where if I just add a grade node here and I just change a color slightly, what we're looking at here in the result is everything that you're looking at that is purple is the plate, and everything that you're looking at that is the regular color is actually the generated area, which is why it's important to key mix, because that way we know that everything that is purple has been completely untouched by any of these generative AI models. You want to keep as much as possible from your original plate, and this is the way of doing that. So you want to make sure that you grade your output to match, and then you key mix it using the mask that you had already created to generate the cleanups. And then once it's key mixed, you know that your results retain as much as possible from the original while introducing the cleanups in the areas that we've treated. So now that you know the process and how to troubleshoot some issues, I want to show you a few more examples. The first one being this clip of just a runner going up some stairs. And what's tricky about this is the amount of parallax that you have on the stairs, the amount of flaring that's going on in the shot. So, while it looks like it should be a simple enough cleanup, once you start really thinking about it, it's going to require a lot more work than you initially think. So again, same thing, I've done some grading. In this case, I even sharpened it a bit, and what my result looks something like this. This is a pretty aggressive cleanup for this workflow, but keep in mind, you have to be smart about how you use this workflow. It's like I said at the beginning, it's not a silver bullet, and it's not something that you're going to plug in and then your work is done. This is something that once you're done, you build upon. it already takes you a long way there, but you still need to do some work on top. If we look at this area here with the handrails, you can see there's a bit of chatter going on. And while we could potentially solve this with just upping steps, most times you won't get a perfect generation out of it. So I figured I'd show you this one because yes, it's tricky. This is a very aggressive cleanup, just removing essentially like a fourth of the screen. And it does a pretty good job, but it still needs a bit of help. Also on this example, I want to show you something else. If we look at this area here again with the chattering on the handrail area, if I look at my more and less version of samples, if I compare this with my version where I did substantially less samples, which is this one now, you can see how there's a lot more swimming, a lot more chattering. So once again, it shows you the importance of being a bit more patient and throwing more samples at it when you find a generation that you like. So again, this is the one I went with, and you see it seems to respect the structure much more, whereas if you look at this one, it's a bit of a, not necessarily a mess, but it's just like morphing and chattering more than it should. So I'm always happy to throw samples at the problem, or not samples, sorry, I mean steps at the problem. And it'll usually put you in a better starting position than not. Next up is this example here of a surfer where I wanted to remove him and his reflection. And this is a good example of where you can really harness the power of these models. Because water is so naturally, fractal and unpredictable, you can get away with some of that chatter that is present in other generations, like the one of the stairs I just showed you. And you can just get away with a lot just because of the way of water behaves. So as you use this workflow more, you'll start thinking of better use cases for it. Doesn't mean that it doesn't work on a lot of things, but it really behaves a lot better on some examples than others. And for this example, I also wanted to show you the before and after of what the upscale model can do for you. And again, upscale models, there are many, so you can just really use any that you like. And in this example, I have my original versus my upscaled. And let me just zoom in here into the water, and you can see how it does quite a bit of work for you. And again, water tends to be very forgiving. So this is a very good example of a shot that really benefits from that upscaling. So as I A/B through here, you can see how much detail it introduces back into your shot. And keep in mind that we're only worried about the area where we're removing the surfer, but we want it to look as good as it can before we put it on top of our shot, so that we can then do our work on top. And then of course, I've gone ahead and I've graded the output so that it matches the plate as closely as possible. And then we have a result that looks something like this. So yeah, not bad considering you can get this result in just a few minutes. Before I move on to the last example, I wanted to circle back and explain something. I'm going quickly through these examples to show you the results of what's possible. But like I've mentioned a few times, this is not meant to be final pixels. So 2 important things for you to assure that you get the best looking comps at the end of this process. Number 1, you should always do the following things to your plates. Make sure you denoise the plates. Make sure you remove any vignettes because that's going to help you achieve cleaner results. And if you have a particularly aggressive chromatic aberration, anything you can do to bring that in line before you do any generations is going to go a long way. So I always take the time to prep the material as much as possible if it's something I'm hoping to use more so than just a test. So denoise, remove vignettes, and reduce chromatic aberration if it's particularly aggressive. And number 2, you should always do the following to your generated results. You want to bring them back into Nuke and basically do everything you did to your plates initially, but in reverse. So make sure you add grain, make sure you add the vignettes that you've removed, and make sure you reintroduce any chromatic aberration you had reined in. So the list is very similar, but there is one very important piece of the puzzle that you should always keep in mind. Don't sleep on Nuke's upscale node. Once again, coming back to my original example, we left it at the place where I just key mixed the result right on top of the plate, and I sort of left it to that just so I could move on to the other examples. But it is very important that you don't just do a quick grade match. You also want to do things like I was mentioning, the upscale node. The upscale node can be tremendously helpful for these types of generations because these models tend to be limited in terms of the quality they can generate. So having access to something like the upscale node is crucial when you want to squeeze out as much quality as you can from these images and videos. So deviating from what I showed you before, where I had my grade stack here going through a reformat so that it key mixes correctly, I'm showing you a different path here where you definitely want to spend the time running it through the upscaler inside of Nuke because it does a really good job of it. and then you want to reformat after the fact so that it matches the resolution of the original video that you're going to be mixing it in. But very importantly, like I said, is also add any things that you removed from the original plate. So like in my case, it was grain. So you want to make sure that you upscale, you reformat, then you grain. And then, of course, at the beginning, you want to make sure that you match the color as closely as you can. Adding these steps in Nuke will make it so that the blend is as seamless as possible, which at the end of the day is what you're after. Finally, I have the shot of a person skateboarding, and I chose this one as a bit of a challenge because there's quite a bit going on here. He is essentially, over time, occluding the entirety of the truck, and I wanted to see how far I could get removing him without providing a reference image. So this is the result I got. And again, this is not perfect, but considering the amount of effort on my part to get this result was just to create a roto that looks something like this, and then running that through ComfyUI, I think you can start seeing the value in this result. And while we're looking at this, I wanted to mention something else that I mentioned before. It's really important that you give your roto shapes a shape that doesn't resemble what you're trying to remove. If I were to do a quick roto for this guy, and I would have stayed much closer to what his silhouette is, the model is going to try to patch up that area with something that resembles that shape. So you always want to go a bit weird with your shapes so that you don't unknowingly push the model in a direction just because it looks at a shape and it's going to make assumptions. Now that I've gone through all the examples I wanted to show you, I also wanted to show you a few of the fails. And again, this was the shot that was toughest to do the removal on, just because of how the person in the skateboard was completely occluding the truck over time. And in this shot, I started by only doing 21 frames because I knew it was going to be tricky and I wanted to do a lot of generations very quickly. So I think I queued something like 20 or 30, and then I walked away for a few minutes, and then I found a seed that was doing what I wanted, which of course led to the result that I showed you in the end. And with that, I want to say thank you for watching. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what is possible with this workflow. I also want to thank the Foundry for having me on your channel. My name is Alex Philibon. You can find me here on YouTube under my name. And until next time, stay curious. Cheers.